Well, I guess we can get started. Welcome, everybody, to this Economic Policy Working Group meeting. We're grateful that Jonathan Berk will be with us today to discuss his paper, Regulation of Charlatans in High-Skilled Professions. I noted in the paper that this goes back to work Milton Friedman, our former colleague, got started with in 1945, if I'm not mistaken, which is quite remarkable. It's a very important topic going forward about regulation and regulation issues and licensing. So, Jonathan, very welcome here. Is Jules going to be with you today? If not, I'll let you just go ahead. Anyway, thank you, Jonathan. And John Cochrane will be co-hosting this with me.
No, Jules, I actually didn't even think about inviting Jules. The Zoom, I didn't make the connection that
that's okay.
You can invite anybody. Okay, let me start this presentation by just saying that the results that I got were totally unanticipated. You know, I didn't start out with the results that I have. I think that's important to appreciate. This wasn't a paper where I had an idea in mind. Now, how do I write a model to get those results? So let me just tell you the path I took to get here. It started with a paper which I think is one of the better papers written recently by Egan, Mattis, and Saru, where they basically scraped the FINRA database and were able to, using the information, the public information on the FINRA database, they were able to show that 7% of financial advisors have a misconduct violation on their record. Half of those who had a violation were fired, and of the half that were fired, half could not find a new job in the industry. So a quarter of the people after the misconduct violation left the industry altogether. And that firms appear to specialize in hiring advisors with misconduct violations. And that was a very controversial paper. And I think it probably holds the record. Within 3 months of it being put on SSRN, Elizabeth Warren was holding it up on the Senate floor. And, she made this big fuss. The president of FINRA was eventually fired, I think, because of this. And she wrote to FINRA, and we write today to ask what specific steps FINRA will take to address the pervasive misconduct amongst its financial advisors to protect families looking to invest their hard-earned earnings. Now, when this paper was written, there was an obvious question. Is 7% a high number or a low number? Okay, is 1/4 of the people leaving the industry a high number or a low number? And so that's where I started. The only way to answer that question is I thought through a theoretical work. And so what I decided to do was think about this in a theoretical way. So, coming at it from that perspective, FINRA is obviously a trade group. So the way we thought about it was, okay, let's think about the two forms of regulation we see. One is certification and the other one is licensing. And the way to think about this is, if you're certified, you can practice, but you don't have to be certified to practice. So a massage therapist is certified. You don't need to get the massage therapist certification. You can still offer massage. Licensing, you must have a license to practice. So unless you have a medical license, you can't be a doctor. So you can think of certification as information disclosure and licensing as government standards. And the question on the table today is, are these forms of regulations good for consumers? Okay, so the question I'm going to talk about today is there a role for government in regulation? And if so, should they be regulating charlatans? Let me define what a charlatan is. A charlatan is somebody who offers the service who doesn't have the skill. So obviously, medical doctors are very well remunerated. So there's an incentive for people to pretend to be a medical doctor, earn the wage, even though they don't have the skill. I'm going to call those people charlatans. And I'm going to assume that the regulation is regulating the entry of charlatans. And so the question that we want to talk about today is, should government agencies try to reduce the number of charlatans by imposing standards, which is the basic premise in the Warren and Cotton quote that I did before. And what is the interest of trade groups? FINRA is, after all, not a government organization, it's a trade group. in setting these standards, and under what conditions is that reducing the number of charlatans desirable. Now, after many years of presenting at the University of Chicago, it took me a while to learn an important lesson. And when John Cochrane is in the audience, you lead with a model. So with that in mind, I'm leading with a model. Okay, so let's go straight to the model. There are a continuum of agents of measure 1 indexed by C. So C indexes agents, okay? There's lambda measure of agents that are skilled. And one of the things I'm going to be concentrating on are skills in short supply. So I'm going to assume lambda is less than a half. In fact, actually, the results go through for lambda less than 1, but lambda is less than a half. So we're going to think about a skill in short supply. Any agent can choose to offer the service, whether they're skilled or not, okay? If you're hired, you earn a wage greater than 0. Otherwise, you earn a reservation wage of 0, okay? So there's some sense where the skill is, your skill gets you rents, and that's why W is greater than 0. I'm going to assume, just for convenience, that agents with the skill do not need to purchase it, right? And the reason I'm going to assume that is that means there's a measure 1 of agents who have a desire to consume, right? But measure 1 plus lambda of potential producers. So even though the skill's in short supply, so their lambda is much smaller than 1. So that means without charlatans, we have a skill in short supply. If the charlatans enter, they flood the market. And then we have a market with many more producers than you have consumers. So that's the basic idea of what I want to model today. And we're going to assume there's a Y fraction of unskilled workers who choose to become charlatans. Most of the time, Y is either 0 or 1. But they are mixing equilibrium. It's not that important. So Y just is the fraction of unskilled workers who choose to offer the service. I'm going to call them charlatans. Okay. Let me tell you how I'm going to model consumer tastes. So there's going to be a cumulative distribution function of consumer valuations of the service with associated density function F, okay? Now, I'm going to define the function B of C, because C, remember, is the index of consumers, okay? I would have liked to be drawing right now, but you're going to have to just bear with me and imagine this. Okay, there's a function B of C that maps 0, 1, so 0, 1 is consumers, into the value consumers placed on the service. So you could think of B of C as consumer C's willingness to pay the maximum amount she's willing to pay for the service. Now, I'm going to assume without loss of generality, I'm going to order consumers so B prime of C is positive. So B of C is upward sloping, okay? If you make that assumption, then what B of C actually is the inverse CDF of the distribution of consumers, okay? And so that's the way it'll come up in a few minutes where I make assumptions on what B of C is. But if you, the inverse CDF of consumer tastes is the willingness to pay function.
Jonathan, could you just clarify the difference between valuation and willingness to pay?
Yes, valuation is the most I'm willing to pay. So that's what I'm going to call valuation. In other words, if you pay that amount, your consumer surplus is exactly 0. And then, by the way, I should have said this at the beginning. I don't like Zoom at the best of times. One of the reasons I don't like it is I think of seminars as a conversation more than a lecture. So I know in this particular case, I'm going to alter the rules. Anybody, if they want to interrupt me, don't put up your hand, unmute yourself and just talk. And I'll be happy to talk to you. And I'm very good at shutting you up. So don't worry about that. Okay, so let's do that because I very much welcome the conversation. Okay.
Yeah. Jonathan, can I take up your invitation?
Yeah.
The empirical evidence you summarized at the outset wasn't necessarily about people who lack the skill to perform the service. It's that they're performing the service fraudulently or something like that. So that's not quite the same as a charlatan, or maybe it is, I don't know. But there's a difference between verifying that someone has the capacity to perform the service and they actually perform the service. And which, are you about both of those or just one of them?
So, I mean, in some sense, this is a psychological question as well, but let me define. A charlatan does not, and I'll talk about this in a second, does not provide the service. You pay him and he doesn't provide the service. Now, you could ask me, does he know that he's incompetent, right? And to that I answer, I think it's a psychological question, but I always answer with one of the greatest lines in all of television. George Costanza says, it isn't a lie if you believe it. Okay? So it's a psychological question, I think. Okay? For my purposes, a charlatan is somebody who doesn't have the skill and provides the service. Okay? Notice that because a BFC is greater than 0, and the reservation wage is 0, we're restricting attention to consumers who value the good at more than the cost to produce it. So just be aware that's another assumption. Okay. Now,
I want to press you a bit more.
Yeah.
I can pass a CFA exam that demonstrates I have skills, but then I can screw over my clients afterwards.
Okay, true. Let me point out something, that passing the CFA exam doesn't necessarily mean you know how to be an accountant. One of the strange things about the exams is they don't test the skill. You know, if I tell the world's best doctor that he has to sit for the board exams without study, he'll fail, indicating that the board exam doesn't test the skill. There are very, very few exams that I know of that actually test the skill. In fact, I only know of 2, and 1 is going away. The one exam that tests the skill is the London cab driver's exam, right? But that's going away because of the thing. And the other one are the mountain guide exam. The mountain guide exam has the feature that one of the things they do to you is they drop you into a crevasse and they say, get out. So those exams really are testing the skills, but most exams don't test the skills. Now, you know, again, I mean, this is a model, but I agree. The dentist, and there are many dentists who know how to do dentistry, but give you fillings you don't need, right? And so, you know, is that part of this? Not strictly. I'm just talking about people that really don't have the skill. But in a sense, it's the same thing. You didn't need that filling. They charge you for the filling. You got the filling, but you didn't need it, right? And so that's the sense of what I'm talking about. This is the cost of leading with a model, by the way. These things I often talk about before the model, but I'm not going to run into John Cochrane giving me shit on this. So as a result, we're going to do the model. Okay. So now, so let's think about the equilibrium when there are no charlatans. Okay, so the full information equilibrium. So in the full information equilibrium, the supply equals lambda, the demand is 1. So not everybody can be satisfied. The wage is B of the 1 minus lambda consumer, right? Because that consumer gets 0 surplus. All the other consumers get positive surplus, so they demand. And any consumer below that consumer would get negative surplus, so they don't demand, and so the market clears. Okay, and so that's the equilibrium when there are no charlatans. You should be aware that what's kind of interesting about this equilibrium is even though the skill is in short supply, we're modeling competition in a way such that there still is some surplus. Okay, because of the heterogeneity in consumers, you still get a bit of surplus. Okay. Right. What happens if there's no information? I know nothing. I would call this a market breakdown. Okay. Here's the continuum of equilibrium. One equilibrium is as follows. The equilibrium wage is 0. Skilled workers work for the reservation wage. They do not enter. Unskilled workers offer the service. Consumers pay nothing and get nothing. That's an equilibrium. There's another equilibrium. The wage is always 0 in the no information equilibrium. But there is an equilibrium with the skilled workers supply, okay, because they're indifferent between the reservation wage and the 0 equilibrium wage. And so in that equilibrium, the consumers get surplus, right? They pay nothing, but there's a probability of hitting a skilled worker. Now, obviously, this equilibrium is not very satisfying because it's not what I would think is very descriptive of the real world. So what we need to do is include information in the equilibrium and to study what I would consider to be the real world and the real supply of skills. So let's do that. I'm going to do it in the context of a very simple example. So I'm going to assume that willingness to pay is distributed uniform. If it's distributed uniform, then the willingness to pay function is linear. So it's just B of C equals C. So it makes everything very simple, okay? Let's assume that producers generate a signal by taking a licensing or certification exam. They either pass or they fail, and that's all you know. And assume that with probability, skilled producers pass with probability Q, and unskilled producers pass with probability P, and obviously Q is greater than P. Okay, so that's the very simple information environment. In that simple environment, the probability of being skilled to be passed the exam is just the supply of people who pass the exam are skilled, which is Q times lambda, over the total supply, which is Q times lambda plus P, obviously the supply of unskilled workers or charlatans is 1. So that's why it's P times 1. Okay. Similarly, this is the probability of being unskilled. By the way, when I do this, can you see my cursor or not? No. Okay. All right. All right. Okay. So with that in mind,
Jonathan, is everybody taking the exam, or are you having, is there yet choice of who's taking the exam?
At the moment, because the reservation wage is 0 and there's no opportunity cost, there's no cost to take the exam, so everybody takes it. In the general model, I will introduce a cost, and which will then select for people who take the exam or not. But for the moment, it's costless to take the exam, so everybody takes it.
And skilled and unskilled know their own type, is that correct?
They know their own type.
Okay, so eventually, only skilled, you're more likely to take the exam if you're going to be skilled, but that's not in here right now.
Not in here, right? So,
okay, thanks.
Okay, so the massive producers who pass the exam, in other words, the massive producers to get the high signal, is going to be lambda Q plus P. So that means consumer 1 minus lambda Q plus P, or 1 minus Q lambda minus P, must be indifferent between consuming the high and low signal, right? That's the equilibrium. Because the wage is 0 for the low signal, this consumer surplus, if she consumes the low signal, is going to be this expression. So it's going to be the left-hand side is surplus in the, no, sorry. This is the, no, sorry. Okay. Start again, Jonathan. If she consumes the low signal, she pays nothing, and she gets pi times her willingness to pay, which is linear. So that's their expression. Indifference implies that this consumer must get the same surplus from consuming the high signal. So what's the consumer surplus from buying a high signal? It's the probability of hitting a skilled person times the willingness to pay times the valuation minus the wage. Okay, and indifference means those two expressions must be equal, which then gives you the expression for the wage. And so that's the equilibrium expression for the wage. Okay, right. Now let's just add up the total consumer surplus. It's just going to be from consumer 0 to 1 minus Q lambda minus P doesn't consume, so they get nothing, right? Okay. That's not true. I'm jumping ahead. Stop. Okay. From consumer 0 to 1 minus Q minus lambda P, they consume, so they get their willingness to pay, but they don't have to pay anything because the wage is 0. So the second term is the surplus from them, and the first term is the surplus for the consumers who consume the high signal. That's going to be, as you can see, the probability that they get that the guy skilled times their willingness times their valuation minus with the wage, and that's the expression for the consumer surplus. Now let's introduce let's simplify the problem and assume Q equals 1. So pi L equals 0. So in that case, the second expression goes away. And so you get, you could do the integral over there. And what you get is lambda p plus lambda over 2. And what's completely shocking about this expression is the signal informative is inverse in P. So that means that more information signals lead to lower surplus. And that's the very first surprising result of this paper, that the more information you give, the worse consumers are off. And I'll explain the intuition in a second, but let me show you that the same result holds for standards. So for standards, let's go back to the general case where Q is less than 1. Notice now that the problem has changed, because now the marginal consumer is forced to choose between consuming and not consuming, right? Because the standard now says you don't get to consume if the guy didn't pass the exam, right? Whereas previously, you could choose to consume even though you knew the guy didn't pass the exam. Now you're forced to only consume if they pass the exam. So that means not consuming implies zero surplus. And so the wage is now this expression. Okay. So then total consumer surplus, the standard is now just all the consumers who consume, which is the 1 minus Q minus lambda minus P consumer to the top consumer. Their willingness to, their valuation is C minus what they pay, but now the wage is now pi 1 minus Q lambda minus P. So if you work that out, and so what do we want to do? We want to subtract consumer surplus in the economy without a standard from consumer surplus to the economy with a standard, and again we get a positive number. The consumers are better off without the standard. Now, why? What is going on here that's causing this result? So here is the intuition of what's going on. Imagine two worlds. One world, we have a cross on every charlatan's head, and the other world, we don't. So if there's a cross on every charlatan's head, we know who the charlatans are, okay? So then we're in the full information equilibrium. And now let's compare this to a world where we don't know who the charlatans are. Well, obviously, the price for the service will drop. It'll drop to reflect that instead of getting the service for sure, I'm now getting the service with some probability, depending on how many charlatans there are. And if that were the only effect, consumers would be indifferent. In the one case, they pay a lot and get a lot. And in the other case, they pay a little and get a little. But there's a second effect. The second effect is the effect of competition. Competition further reduces prices. And because of that, consumers are better off in the world with charlatans. Obviously, the opposite is true for producers, because the person who pays for the charlatan is the skilled producer. So producers are hurt by the presence of charlatans, not consumers. Then the next thing you could ask is, okay, Jonathan, what about, okay, well, I'll come to that side in a second. Okay, let me go, no, I'm gonna go to that side and I'll come back. What about the total surplus? What's interesting is, even if we want to maximize total surplus, in other words, consumer surplus plus producer surplus, which, by the way, our government doesn't do. Our government is explicit. They want to maximize consumer surplus. But let's assume that we realize, well, producers have surplus too, so let's maximize the sum. Notice that disclosure always increases total surplus by the usual economic argument that more information leads to better matches. However, producers already have that incentive, right? They're the ones who are screwed by not having information revealed. So if there should be no reason for a government to want to induce producers to reveal. They already are fully incentivized to reveal. Standards, on the other hand, decrease total surplus. And the reason standards decrease total surplus is by imposing a standard, you reduce the supply of the skill, and the supply of the skill is in short supply. So that reduces total surplus. So therefore, if you want to maximize total surplus, you definitely don't want to put a standard in, and there's no reason to disclose. And so I think the result here is that even if you maximize total surplus, there really isn't a good reason to regulate.
Jonathan, could
Yeah.
I go back just a second? Because I just wanted to at least make sure I'm understanding. First of all, I would dispute your statement that our government only is interested in consumer surplus and not producer surplus. I think actually a good description of politics would be exactly the opposite.
Yes, I agree with you. I'm just telling you on paper. But
Okay.
the second half of this paper is going to be the only explanation of what we see is the producers have taken over government and got them to pass laws to increase their surplus.
Let me, however, just back on the technical results, because there's a few things I was confused about. You said increasing competition. So what's the nature of competition between I just forgot some of the symbols. So this clearly depends on, I thought that the suppliers of were competing among each other as in perfect competition, but apparently not. So
No.
Why is there?
They are competing in perfect competition. So, but the number of them, they're competing in perfect competition under the world of I can't distinguish charlatans from skilled producers, right?
No, but when you can,
Number of charlatans. What do you say?
Aren't the skilled producers competing among each other even when you can distinguish them?
Yes, and that was the very first example. The very first when I did on full information. Notice how even under full information there is still some consumer surplus, and that comes from the fact that consumers are heterogeneous.
Okay.
Right. And so therefore the market clearing price leaves the marginal consumer indifferent, but everybody else has some amount of rents. Right? If consumers are identical, then you get an equilibrium where consumers get no rents.
So you're basically saying you're better off if you might get a doctor and you might get a witch doctor, but you don't pay as much for the doctor if you actually get him. I'm just trying to understand
So when I go to the more different model,
your supply of skill is fixed, right? So when the doctors get paid more, you don't get more people going to medical school.
Yes.
That's in the current model. Okay.
That's a critical assumption of this model.
That's fine.
Okay.
I just want to
That's
understand
the
the
model, but I would say that that's what I'm studying. I want a skill short supply, right?
So, a flat supply curve would change things. And the charlatans don't actually hurt people, right? They just provide a useless service.
They just provide useless. So we have an extension. We have another paper, which I don't even intend to publish, but it's out there to deal with harm because people, especially in the case of medicine, people get very upset with this result. And I'm going to talk about it in a second.
That's where I was going.
Yeah. But we show that the harm certainly doesn't affect the standards. When you introduce harm, it doesn't affect the standards, and I'll explain to you why in a second. And
harm to me that doesn't benefit the doctor?
What?
I would think of harm to me that doesn't benefit the doctor as just a social loss that standards would stop.
No, and the reason is, so I'll come to this in a second when I do the general model, but
okay,
it's not that there are no standards without government intervention. There's already a standard, which we'll call the market standard. The question is not, should we have standard, no standard versus no standard, is should the government introduce a standard above the market standard? And that's the problem. When the government introduces a standard above the market standard, it needlessly reduces the supply of skill.
So the standard is the level of you still have to certify your skill. So you have to take a test, and the question is, what's the level of the test?
So the information technology I'm using is a general technology. I mean, I haven't specified it, but imagine that, I'll talk about this in a second, that there's a market standard. In other words, the market supply of skill is the market demand is 1 plus the market supply with charlatans is 1 plus lambda. The demand is 1, right? Which means there has to be a market clearing wage such that some people choose not to consume. I'm calling that the market standard. Now the question is, so that means people say, look, this level, I need a certain amount of quality in the signal measure, in the signal, such that I'm willing to use the charlatan, use the producer. And if the producer is less than that signal, that producer cannot find a consumer, and therefore he doesn't work. And I'm going to call that the market standard. The question then is, should the government introduce a standard above that? And the answer is no, and you can see why. Because introducing a standard above that hurts consumers because it reduces competition and reduces the supply of skill. And that's not good. In some sense, that result is in the literature in verbal form. There's a lot of verbiage talking about, that standards are bad because they reduce competition. But what that literature hasn't carefully thought about is, then they'll say, so therefore we should only have certification. What I'm saying is, no. Certification is also bad because the same result applies to information. That by revealing information, you also reduce competition.
So you're having a vision where I can tell you my score on the medical boards, not just did I pass or not pass.
Yes. Although you could.
That's another puzzle. Okay, but go ahead.
Certification, by the way, it doesn't rule out what you're saying. I can also have a world where I reveal all I reveal is I pass, no pass, right? In fact, that was the first example. I revealed that I pass, no pass, but you can still work, right? And then the market wage, you saw in that first example, it isn't a good example to illustrate this because they're just 2 states. But even in that example, the market wage goes to 0. Jonathan, you don't pass the exam.
Jonathan, I think you can resurrect an argument for standards, and not what I'm endorsing, but if you assume that the regulator knows more about the costs of being treated by a charlatan than the consumer does. And I think that is the view that many people have. They just think the regulators are technocrats who know better, and they're protecting the consumers from their own ignorance about the cost of being served by a bad doctor. In that case, I think you can rationalize standards.
Yes, and in the paper, at the end of the paper, we addressed that issue head on. I would say the following: you're absolutely right. If you believe that the government is all-knowing, then that's a good reason to regulate. I would, no, if you believe consumers don't know their own taste and the governments do know the consumers' tastes, then yes, there is a good reason to regulate. I share with you some skepticism on that. I don't really think the government is that good at things. And I will share the following piece of empirical results, which is, one of the reasons I'm kind of interested in this subject is, of course, the regulation of financial advisors and mutual fund managers. And, it's died down now, but there's this huge move afoot to say, well, if people are not allowed to put their IRA money amongst active managers because active managers are such ripoffs, right? Well, I have another paper with Jules where we actually show exactly the opposite. That in fact, consumers in the mutual fund space are remarkably rational, certainly more rational than most regulators seem to be in that space. So, just saying, oh my God, the government knows more than consumers, I think at the very least, you'd have to show some empirical evidence for that. And in fact, that's the major push of this paper. I am not suggesting we stop regulating, obviously not. But what I am suggesting is we change the status quo. Right now, the status quo is you don't have to provide any evidence. And you just say, I'm regulating in the interest of consumers. I don't think that's right. If you wish to claim that a regulation benefits consumers, you need to show why. You need to provide evidence why. And that's what I'd like this paper to change in the public debate. You can't just assert that the regulation benefits consumers.
Jonathan, you're going to also come back to where the private sector provides this, consumer reports, things like that, which
Well, in some sense, it depends which private sector, because of course FINRA is a private sector company, right? It's a trade group, so it's not part of the government, right? I'm not going to talk about the other private sector you have in mind, which is that consumers band together and provide that information. But what's odd about that is, obviously, my own incentive as a consumer is to gather information. But as a group, consumers do not want to gather information. Now, that could be an equilibrium where we just get the wrong outcome. All of us decide we want to gather information, and so we pay consumers reports. But again, I mean, that's a separate equilibrium and a separate thing to think about. Okay. All right. So let me go to from the specific model to the more general model. I assume anybody else has questions, now would be a good time to actually ask them. Okay. So here's what I'm going to do in the general setup is I'm going to assume that that there is a signal generation process. The signal generation process works like this. It's a normally distributed random variable. It has mean 0 if you're unskilled and mean 1 if you're skilled. And I'm going to then parameterize the model by the variance of that of the normal distribution. Okay, and so just to give you a sense of this, because I'm going to show you some pictures. If sigma equals 0.2, then these are the two normal. Red is skilled, blue is unskilled. So 0.2 is a very informative signal. 2 is the graph on the, you can see there, and that is a very uninformative signal. So when I parameterize things, I'm going to go from 0.2 to 2. So from a very informative signal to a very uninformative signal. Okay. So that being the case, probability of being skilled given your signal is just going to be using Bayes' law. This formula, I mean, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's obviously just the probability of the same as before, the density of skilled over the total supply. Okay, now I'm going to introduce an opportunity cost, which is that after you have generated a signal, the reservation wage drops to minus A. So you think of A as being the opportunity cost of generating the signal. I could have also introduced a regular cost, but the opportunity cost and the regular cost will have exactly the same effect ex ante, but the opportunity cost also has an effect ex post. So it's a better cost to look at, and I'm going to argue it's important. So I'm introducing this as an opportunity cost versus just a cost of getting the signal. So here's the timing. The agents first decide when they will offer the service, okay? So they'll obviously offer the service whenever the expected wage equals or exceeds 0, because the reservation wage at time 0 at the beginning is 0. Then they draw a signal, and based on their wage is going to be a function of the signal, okay? Once they know their signal, they then decide if they're going to produce, and obviously at this point the wage is dropped to minus A. Oh, by the way, the model holds A equals 0. So this is just an added thing. But assuming A is positive, the wage drops to minus A, and then they decide if they want to produce, and obviously they only produce if the wage exceeds minus A. And then each consumer picks one provider based on that provider signal.
May I make an interruption here?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So I'm Bill Poole. I live in the northeast corner of Maryland. You can see the chart of the Chesapeake Bay behind me there. And I'm going to give you some sort of extreme examples. When I saw the title, I thought the issues would be likely ones like this. I go to Elkton, Maryland to get a haircut. Now, that's not a super high skill profession, to be sure. The barber who works on my hair, I think he does a pretty good job. Actually, it's a woman now, but he said he took the training in Delaware. Well, why doesn't he practice in Delaware? Well, it's because Delaware requires a year worth of barber school before you're allowed to cut hair in Delaware. And there's of course a literature on the way in which local jurisdictions protect the people working in that jurisdiction. Now, on something much more serious, let's say heart surgery, and fortunately I haven't had to go there, but on something much more serious, I would go to Johns Hopkins Hospital, which is not too far away, and I would put a great deal of trust in Johns Hopkins, one of the greatest medical centers in the world, in controlling the quality. I put much more trust in Johns Hopkins than I would in the regulation by the state, because I could go to the local hospital in Elkton if I wanted, a little country hospital, and there's probably a surgeon there who would work on me if I asked him to, but I would go to Johns Hopkins. Seems to me that that's a much more important dimension of this problem, just coming from your title, a much more important dimension of this problem than the dimensions that you're talking about. The extent to which you have repeat service as opposed to one-off service, I think is critically important. Heart surgery in most cases is a one-off service, whereas a haircut, a dentist, and many others are repeat transactions. And you learn a lot about the provider from the repeat transactions. That's the question of the information you get, the customer gets. And so I believe that there are many professions where the customers get the feedback in terms of the quality of the service, whether the person is qualified or is a charlatan, perhaps, and you make the judgments through a market process. Those are the dimensions that were brought to mind by the title of this lecture.
And I would say that that's what I'm studying. That's what you can think of a signal. I mean, I'm not telling you where the signal comes from, but that's you getting information about your provider. What I would say is the following. Look, you can go to Johns Hopkins, whether or not the government regulates. The question is the following. Assume there was no regulation of doctors and you had heart disease. Trust me, you would still go to Johns Hopkins, and Johns Hopkins would still provide a high quality service. The difference would be the price Johns Hopkins would charge would not be the same as the price that they do charge with a lot of regulation. I mean, nowhere in this situation am I assuming that consumers are using charlatans without their knowledge. They fully understand it. And when it's like the difference between a chiropractor and a back surgeon, right? If you've got a sore back, you go to a chiropractor. If you have a slipped disc, you're not going to see a chiropractor. You're going to see a real doctor, right? And so the issue is, how much are you paying for that service? The point here is the presence of chiropractors reduces the price of the slip disc surgery. And that, and that is very, I mean, I didn't set out to show this. I originally approached this problem by thinking I would find an optimal level of regulation. It came as a shock to me to find out there isn't an optimal level of regulation. And it's because of this, of the effect of competition on the equilibrium. I mean, it's nobody. Okay, let me finish this, so I can define the concept of the market standard, and then I can talk about the fact that it's not that there isn't a standard. There is a market standard for heart surgery. The question is not, we're not going to have any standards for heart surgery. The question is the standard for heart surgery going to be higher than the standard that would otherwise be there if there was no regulation? So, okay, so in this case, there's going to be an equilibrium wage function, which is going to be a function of the signal, and a consumption function. So what's a consumption function? Well, it's for every signal, there's going to be a person who got that signal, and then there's going to be a consumer who chooses that producer. And the C function is the consumer that produces the signal of the producer who got that signal. Or in shorthand, it's the signal the consumer consumes. Okay? And so that's the equilibrium. There'll be these two functions. And in equilibrium, all skilled agents will choose to obtain a signal, and a fraction of unskilled agents will choose to obtain a signal. Most of the time, that fraction will be either 0 or 1. Agents with a signal, so there'll be what I call a market standard. Agents with signals that exceed lambda, new bar choose to produce, and the other ones optimally choose not to produce. So that's what I'm calling the market standard. Consumers maximize the benefit of consuming, so they maximize the consumer surplus, subject to the condition that the surplus is positive. And finally, markets clear. That's just the final statement. On any, if I integrate from the worst producer producing, which is a new bar, up to any producer, okay, then on the left-hand side of that equation is the total supply, which is just obviously the measure of skill times the density of skill, plus the measure of unskilled Y, which is either 0 or 1 usually, times the density of Y. So that integrated is the supply, and obviously the demand is going to be all the consumers that consume that signal. So the integral of that, and that's the equilibrium. And what's nice about this model is it solves out very simply. These are the two functions. This is the consumption function, and this is the wage function. There's something very interesting about this wage function. If you look at it, you'll see that the first term of the wage function would be the wage function if consumers got no surplus. So if the other two terms in the wage function did not exist, then all consumers would pay their valuation, right? Which is just B of C, which is the willingness to pay times the probability of skill. But in fact, they pay less, and they pay less for two reasons. The first reason is the last term. It is minus A. And where that comes from is it determines new bar, right? We have to set the wage such that a fraction of consumers choose not to consume, a fraction of producers, sorry, choose not to produce. Okay, so the last term is the competition from potential producers. We have to lower the wage to stop those producers from entering. And the middle term is competition from existing producers, which is, you can see, you only care about the producers below you, because those are the people that are going to undercut you. And so you can see it's the integral of all the producers below you. And so the middle term is competition from existing producers, and the last term is competition from potential producers. And wages are reduced by both terms. I'll come back to this in a second. But just to see the result, let's compare the full information equilibrium to the partial information equilibrium. So remember, before, the wage and the full information equilibrium is just B of 1 minus lambda. Now this is the wage in the partial information equilibrium. If I then calculate consumer surplus in the full information equilibrium, let's make it simple and let's make consumers identical. If a consumer is identical, then obviously the full information equilibrium surplus is 0. But notice in the partial equilibrium information equilibrium, the consumers is the surplus is not 0. So let's just see why. So the first line there is the wage function. So so I just plug in B of BC equals 1. So the middle term drops out. So we get the wage function is just the probability of getting the service minus this A, which is the drop in wages to keep our potential consumers. So then I just calculate consumer surplus, which is the next line, which is the surplus minus the wage. And as you can see, I get A. So I get a strictly positive consumer surplus in the equilibrium with partial information, which is reminiscent of what we saw before. Okay. And then there's pictures I want to know. So now I want to introduce a standard. So I'm going to introduce a standard by saying a signal has to exceed nu hat in order for the producer to produce. Right? So obviously, we're going to the only interesting equilibria where mu hat above mu bar, because if mu hat below mu bar, it's irrelevant anyway. So let's now, by the way, in the previous equilibrium, there was no way to keep out charlatans. Why? Because we were always setting no matter what the information in the equilibrium with full information, then yes, lambda bar is always set so that the supply equals demand, which always necessarily has charlatans as part of the equilibrium, right? So now if we introduce a standard, we could set the standard high enough so that given the opportunity cost, the charlatans would choose not to enter. And so the very first question we can ask is, do we want to set a standard high enough to stop the charlatans from entering? Okay, so there are three cases in this equilibrium. We can set up an equilibrium where the standard is so high there are no charlatans. We can set a standard where the standard is low, so it's like the other equilibrium where it features charlatans. Or you could set the standard such that charlatans are exactly indifferent, and so you get a mixing equilibrium where a certain fraction of charlatans enter. If you solve that out, you get a very similar consumption function and a very similar wage function. But notice one thing, the wage function no longer has the minus A in it. It's very similar to the last wage function. I think the next slide actually compares the two. Yeah. So it's very similar to the last wage function, but the difference is it doesn't have the minus A term. Why not? And the answer is, in the previous world where there were no standards, the market wage had to adjust to keep the charlatans out. But now the standard is doing that. And so the market wage, remember the standard's always above the minimum market standard. So whenever you introduce that standard, the number of charlatans is now less than the total demand. And so it's the total supply is less than the total demand. So you no longer need wages to drop to keep out the charlatans. And so the minute you introduce a standard, even epsilon above the market standard, wages jump by the opportunity cost. Okay. Now, let's take a step back here and go to the question that came up earlier, which is, what about public policy and what about why do we see these standards? So given the fact that standards and disclosure benefit producers, not consumers, and yet we see an enormous amount of regulation in the economy along the lines of disclosure and standard, one has to assume that those standards are put in place because producers have convinced governments to do what they want, even though governments, in the name of protect consumers. So with that in mind, let's do the following optimization. Let's pick the standard that a producer would choose, okay, if the producers got to pick the standards.
Jonathan,
yeah.
Before we go to producers, I just, a related thought. A lot of regulation consists of high-income consumers imposing their preferences on the other ones. Is there a case here that the people who value the service most benefit in some way from the regulations, or
Yes, there is. I think, God, let me just give me a second to think. Yes, I think it's the case. I mean, I forget now the result. I certainly knew it at one point. But I think it's the case that while consumer surplus always increases, it doesn't mean the consumer surplus of everybody increases.
Right, that's where I was
and
going.
the rich consumers are hurt. I think you're right. I mean, that's what I recall, and I can't do it in my head right now. But the rich consumers are hurt. The people who value the good most are hurt by the disclosure of information. There aren't that many of them.
Well, they're going to pay the most. I mean, a lot of the motivation, like eyeglasses. Why do you have to get a $500 eyeglass prescription to get eyeglasses when you know what it is? It's sort of rich consumers saying, well, we can't let poor people be served by poor quality eyeglasses, sorts of things. So certainly the option to buy the lower quality service is most valuable to poor people. But I'm thinking the restriction of competition is going to hurt the rich people as well, because they're going to pay more for their service.
They are, but in fact, there are consumers that are the very richest are in fact can be made worse off by disclosure information, and you can see why, because you know when you introduce charlatans, lots of poor people have some probability of consuming. It's a low probability, but they have some. Without charlatans, they have no probability of consuming, right? And so you can see how it helps people. But it also depends. If obviously, when consumers are identical, it makes no difference. But also it depends on the shape of the B function. As we show in the paper, that you need a B function that where the skill is in demand. And in the paper, what this means is you need to have the distribution of valuations such that you need the distribution of valuations such that a lot of people demand the skill. And we formally make this in the paper by showing that the effect is exactly zero. There is no effect if underlying distributions are a negative exponential distribution, meaning that if the number of people who don't value the service exponentially dominate the number of people that do value the service, this effect will go away. So anything other than that, the effect is there. And then how it's there for a normal distribution, for example, it's obviously there for a uniform distribution, it's there for a regular exponential distribution, but how those distributions affect the distribution of rents amongst consumers is different.
Well, I'll just leave that as a question. Is there a question is there a version of the analysis that explains why rich people vote for laws and impose laws that don't let poor people buy low quality versions of the same service?
Yes, you could write a model for a particular distribution function for which that will be true.
Jonathan, interrupter, you want to finish your presentation and make sure and we come back to questions?
Yes, I want to finish very quickly here because I just want to do the final thing, which is assume now, let me just quickly tell you what the trade-off is. So from the producer's trade-off, that there is an optimal standard, unlike from consumers. And it's a trade-off between two things. If I set a very high standard, then if I set the standard high enough, I can keep all charlatans out. But because the standard is so high, I catch a lot of skilled producers. If I set a low standard, I don't catch a lot of producers, but the standard is low enough, I can't. That's the trade-off. So now what I'm plotting here is the optimal as a function of A, the opportunity cost, sigma, the informant of the signal, and lambda, the number of the amount of skill in the economy. What this is points to the left of the curves are points where equilibria include charlatans, and points to the right of the curve are equilibria where the standard is so high they've kept all the charlatans out. And what you can see is what I want to take away from this from this picture is medicine and finance. So in medicine, A is very large. You have to go to medical school for 12 years. It's an enormous opportunity cost to go to medicine. So because A is so large, when A is large, there are lots of space on this curve where the optimal is for the trade group to set the standard high enough so that you keep all charlatans out. On the other hand, finance, there is absolutely no opportunity cost. Anybody can take one of these exams and become a financial analyst. And so it's so, because the opportunity cost is so low, the trade group can't set it. The standard would have to be so high to keep the charlatans out that there'd be nobody who, even the skill producers, couldn't pass the standard. And that's why we see low standards in finance and lots of charlatans and high standards in medicine and few charlatans. Of course, I'm saying this based purely on anecdotal evidence.
Yeah, that's not true. I mean, those series exams are really hard to take. You have to spend a lot of time studying securities law and regulation that would put you to sleep in no time flat, because it's not about your ability to generate alpha. It's about, can you comply with all the various regulations and the know your customer and the sort of the serious anti-fraud sort of stuff.
No, I would disagree with you. I think the medical boards are much harder to pass. And
much harder, but it's not costless.
Yeah, okay, hold on, let me finish.
We can ask,
everybody passes it. What do you say, John?
maybe we can ask John Gunn to say a few words about this financial analyst part. I don't know if he hears, John. Actually, I think this is now getting into the policy part of it.
Yeah.
How does your model apply to florists, electricians, plumbers, hairstylists, barbers, like Bill Poole mentioned? Because that seems to be like
there the model isn't a stock because there's a trade-off. Because so this model is specifically written by skill in short supply. I mean, I don't really think that florists, the skills in that short supply. And that's going to change the model, because then when the wages change, the supply of skill changes. Okay, that doesn't mean the results are incorrect. What it means is you need to show the elasticity is big enough to reverse the effect I'm talking about, which is the effect of competition. So in that case, you have to think about, okay, well, it might be the case that the elasticity is big enough, but again, I would say you need to show it. You can't just assume it, right? And you could imagine that the elasticity isn't big enough and the competition effect is larger, in which case we don't want to regulate. I mean, just finishing this point with John about the series exams, sure, they're not, sure, they're difficult to pass, but if you study hard enough, then you can pass them and still know nothing about finance. It's much harder to pass the medical boards and know nothing about medicine. Not because the medical boards test medicine, but because you can't take those medical boards unless you've done whatever many years of medical training, right?
So people have questions. Jump into Steve, go ahead.
I've got another kind of question comment. Your analysis is silent on the character of the entry barriers that are put up. Some of these entry barriers seem to have no redeeming professional or social value, and others do. And somebody gave the example, maybe it was you earlier, of I guess it was Bill Poole. You know, you got to work as essentially as a serf, an indentured servant almost for a hairdresser in order to get your hairdresser's license. And you were just alluding to it, Jonathan. You know, you can't become a doctor without knowing something about medicine, but maybe you can become a financial analyst knowing almost nothing about financial analysis. So I think there's a big issue about not just the fact that there are these standards, but how they are implemented and why they seem to be ludicrous in some cases.
Now, I would say that it's because the trade groups are the powerful entities here, and they're maximizing producer surplus. That yes, I think what's needed is, I don't for one moment suggest the way you should read this paper is remove all regulation. I mean, that's way too that's way too it's way too big a leap from an economic model. All an economic model is a way of making an economic argument. But the argument that I would say is you have to justify the regulation. You have to clearly outlay the objective. And if Warren and Cotton and all these people say the objective is consumer surplus, then they say, okay, if consumer surplus is the objective, what regulation maximizes consumer surplus? That's completely absent from the debate in all of these things. And I think that's where we want to focus on. Focus the regulators on justifying why they're doing it.
So maybe just go back to the various examples, florists, hairstylists. It sounds like you're saying there's different criteria for each of these industries. I mean, I think they're all too much occupational licensing personally, but how would you apply, so gardeners, plumbers, how would you apply this? Doctors are one thing, financial analysts yet another. How do you apply it?
Well, I mean, John, I would say while these things are problems, I mean, I would say in this high skilled professions, the problems are much larger. I mean, you know, how much of the cost of medicine is this ridiculous restriction on entry? You know, I mean, you remember when you set the standards really high, like that in medicine, you also restrict the number of skilled producers entering. Right? Even, you know, there are no charlatans in medicine, I'll give you that. But there are also a lot of people who could be doctors who are not doctors because it was just too hard to deal with medical school and getting into medical school. So if you lowered the standards and you allowed more medical schools, sure, you're going to have a few more charlatans, but you're going to have a lot of skilled producers as well, and the cost of medicine will be lower. So
I think that one is so there are alternatives. You can become a nurse practitioner, you can become a chiropractor, you can become an acupuncturist and so forth. What we do then is restrict who may do what. You know, we require a doctor's prescription to get a COVID test, or at least we did until last week, further driving demand to those places. But it's not just all or nothing doctor. The other consideration is in a lot of these things that we're talking about here, there is a difference. Some of the tests bear on your capacity to do what you're supposed to do. And some of the tests, like the barbershop example, probably are not any good at producing better barbers. So to the extent to which the thing is costly to gain, but also to the extent to which it's a signal that says something about your ability to do it, varies a lot across these different cases.
I agree, and John, I don't want to make it sound like I'm dismissing the issues of all the other professions, so-called professions, which have, I agree, seemingly ridiculous licensing and certification requirements. They do. I just want to be careful about that because it's not as clear in that case. When there's a supply response, that supply response could flip the result. So that, you know, if you want to think carefully about that, you'd have to say, well, how big is the supply response going to be, you know, to a change in wages if we were to reduce the regulation? And I think you'd have to think about that. I mean, another reason why that's not in this model is the existing literature is almost focused on that supply response. So it's kind of well researched. And so that's another reason we didn't look at that. But I agree. I mean, there's certainly, we should, you know, the number of professions in the paper, we document this, the number of professions that are subject to regulation is just astronomical. I mean, the haircut example, there's this example in Louisiana of somebody coming from Africa who has no other form of employment. And what she does is she, you know, what's it called? Corn braids, right? She does the corn braids and she makes a living doing it. And the hairdressers, whatever, told her, no, you can't do corn braids. You have to take this license exam. It's going to cost you $10,000, which she doesn't have. I mean, completely ludicrous.
But this is outside your, so there's a different kind of model, which is simply standard monopoly, where it's going to cost you $10,000 to get into this profession because we're restricting supply of this profession. That cost has nothing to do, it's no signal whatsoever of ability or even gain skill or anything. It's just you got to buy a taxi medallion to run a taxi, which seems like the right example for what's going on there.
Yeah, I agree. But I think that they would classify it as some kind of licensing. I mean, the funny thing, they've got the government they co-opted the government because it's not certification. Because certification is chic in practice. So they've co-opted the government to write a law that says this organization here, FINRA here, or whatever it is, has the ability to decide if you get to cut hair.
Could I ask a question, unless someone else wants to jump in, about the technology changing, which changes this whole game? This business that we're in, education, for example, I can give a series of lectures, anyone around the world can hear it, where we're charging a huge amount for Stanford students. That can't be an equilibrium. So if there's any thoughts you have about how this improvements in technology is going to affect this whole thing, maybe your model will have some impacts there.
I don't know, it's a good question. I haven't thought about that. But certainly. It's a completely separate question, but you're right. I mean, the skill is in short supply largely because of things like education and things like that are concentrated, and therefore they're part of the world where the supply is lower. To the extent that you have technology solve some of those problems, so you can have a larger supply of skill. It could change the results. Though I haven't said that, so long as it's in short supply, but you could never imagine that isn't the case because, human beings, there's an intelligence distribution amongst human beings, and you certainly need a certain number of intelligence to be a doctor or a lawyer or a financial person. So as long as there's that short supply, it's still going to be the case that regulating these industries is not in consumers' interests.
So I have one of the questions on the policy side. What, as I said, my inclination, I think yours is too, is there's way too much occupational licensing, generally speaking. But how does this help you move the policy? What is the way that we can go to Sacramento or Washington, and what is the angle there on the policy?
I think that's a very good question. Here's how I think you explain it. You first of all say, look, there are two reasons why charlatans reduce prices. One is you've got an expected the good isn't as good. In the one case, when there are no charlatans, you get a good. When in the case where there's a charlatan, you get a less good, and therefore the price is reduced for that level. But that you're indifferent. You pay a lot, you get a lot the other way. But there's a second effect, which is the presence of charlatans increases competition and reduces prices for a second reason. So that makes consumers better off. And then, of course, they'll respond to you by saying, oh, my God, are you serious? You're going to let anybody be a doctor and kill us? And then the response there is no. We're not suggesting that. Why? Because even without regulation, people don't, if they've got something serious, they're going to pay to get somebody with a very good signal. Right? So the question is, let me just finish this. The question is, when will they pay more? If you've got something serious and there's no regulation, you're going to have to pay a hell of a lot to get a high enough signal to be sure that you're not getting a charlatan. So you're paying a lot. The question is, are you going to pay, if in the world without the charlatans, you're actually also going to have to pay, and it's more.
I think you're doing yourself a disservice by calling it charlatans, because the issue in most of these practical things is, do we allow lower income people to buy lower quality services at much lower prices? Not from charlatans, just, a painter who's a little more slapdash, but costs half as much will we allow people to do that? Will we allow them to not build their houses to the same extreme levels of zoning code that we do? Same with doctors. We will allow them to see a nurse practitioner for things that we otherwise require doctors for. You're going to make a much more public policy by saying we're going to, or can you get a pair of glasses with a 4-year-old prescription and not have a brand new prescription from a licensed optometrist? Can you allow Warby Parker to give folk, eye things without demanding that they also check you for eye cancer and so forth? So I think that's rather than charlatans, because the example that you started with is also not, the examples you started with were not people who said they had alpha but didn't have alpha. It's people who committed fraud. It's literally about cooking the books and stealing money from their customers. That's not nothing that any amounts of years of MBA teaches or doesn't teach. And protecting people from fraud is quite different than in protecting people from
So John, I agree.
Poor skill.
I agree with you, John, but if you speak to the policy people, they're not saying to you, the standards are to keep out bad people to pay houses. The standards are there because they're going to be people who will, not paint the house at all. I mean, in other words, when people talk about standards and everything, it's usually in the extreme form. It's usually in, oh my God, we definitely need these standards because otherwise the doctor won't know what they're doing, right? And so in that sense, I disagree. I think that if you could talk to policy people, you really do have to say, okay, look, even in the extreme case, so obviously in your case it's less extreme, but even in the extreme case, it's not in consumers' interests.
I think we're just about out of time. Jonathan, thank you so much. This is an eye-opener in many respects, but especially the model. We like that a lot. But thank you everybody for attending, and see you next week, I hope. Thank you, Jonathan.